And this propaganda is also just completely ahistorical. We hear U.S. and Israeli propaganda that, well, the U.S. and Israel are so progressive when it comes to queer rights, and that, Palestinians and other countries and societies across the Middle East and North Africa are violently homophobic, X, Y, and Z. But then, you just have to rewind a few decades back to the Cold War. Who murdered all of the secular socialists who were either governing or, on the rise in these countries? It was the US or Israel. They undermined them, they murdered them, they forced them into exile. And in that power vacuum is where you got, the current Islamist parties who are in certain levels of power in different countries. The first example I can think of is Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. He was a secular socialist, nationalized Iran's oil supply, and he was couped by the British and the CIA. And then that's, one of the causes that leads to the Iranian Revolution, and then, the reaction that came from that.
Mm-hmm. And something that our friend Izzy Mustafa reminded us is that it was queer organizers responsible for the most recent string of uprisings in Palestine. Like, people work real hard once again to erase the queer leadership in Palestinian liberation struggles. The queer leadership, the women's leadership, just to reinforce the racist U.S. propaganda talking points.
I mean, right? It was like, I always think of like an example here in Turtle Island that is really familiar for people, like Standing Rock, probably, right? Would be kind of a big one over the last decade. And if you think about who really galvanized that particular uprising, it was queer youth, actually, and also like young women, basically. And so I think it's something that I feel like I talk about this a lot, but I don't know if like historically it's spoken about much, about how like our LGBTQ2 relatives are actually like leaders in a lot of our most militant and revolutionary struggles and victories in history as Indigenous people. I mean, and in general, I would say, and in general, and I think this current like intifada happening in Palestine is another example of that. But I also wanted to going back to like the more Indigenous context. This is kind of where we were in conversation 10 minutes ago, if it's okay. I wanted to ask you too what you thought, because you were talking, Kennard, about like the real material conditions that like LGBTQ2 people face, and how symbolic victories, like, yes, we should, those are good, but we actually need material change, right? Given the conditions and these struggles. What do you think are the most common or difficult struggles that like queer Indigenous people are facing today? Like, what are things we should be organizing on, right? And like doing political education on, and like really trying to do work on as the Red Nation, or just like as other relatives who care?
I think this actually kind of circles back to this idea of liberal individualism that a lot of us are brought up with in this country. Is that again, we're taught to conceptualize and identify with our queerness in whatever form it may take through the lens of individualism, through like the American liberal sort of vantage point, when there's a lot of our own rich queer histories in so many of our own tribal communities. But as a side effect of settler colonialism, a lot of those histories are buried, like very, very, they're buried, sanitized, depoliticized. Melanie, I'm sure we can both agree, like Navajos are a very gay people. We're a very trans people. Like, it's pretty much embedded in our culture, even in our creation story, which, we can't talk about because it's not winter. But it's the fact that we're so disconnected from that. I think that's one point of political education, is getting us to connect with our own communal histories. And Jen, I'm sure you can probably talk about, Puebloan history and queerness, how that's also been buried deep by, in your case, Catholicism.
Yes, very deep, very, very deep. Yeah, so much so that a lot of us struggle to even learn the words we had to describe queerness, to describe our trans relatives, to describe sexuality and gender. And, you know, individuals who are even alive like 60, 70 years ago, people work really hard to erase their existence and their presence and their legacy. And, you know, gender and sexuality is constantly policed, and it's really disturbing, but people know, there is evidence, right, in our stories and even in ceremonial life that, you know, gender didn't adhere to the binary we know today. And, you know, it's really, the evidence is all around you if you care to look at it. And I think people have to, again, really work hard and go out of their way to try to deny the existence of gender variance and queer sexuality throughout history, throughout our history. But yeah, again, I won't get into that because it's not appropriate.
I think also,
here, but it's there.
You know, pushing back against this narrative that, you know, that the res is some sort of like inherently backward, racist, homophobic place. You know, it kind of reminds me of like the same way that people talk about the southern United States as like inherently unsalvageable, because of like the way that voting patterns happen, even though, you know, there's an entirely separate story about why, you know, voting goes the way it does in the South. Like, I'm only speaking from my own perspective, but, you know, like I had a pretty boring, when it comes to like being queer, my childhood was pretty boring. Like I never had to come out. Both of my parents didn't really care, which is like, you know, probably the best possible outcome I could ask for. I think, you know, like when it came down to it, I was kind of like, yeah, you guys know I'm gay, and, you know, nature and nurture, either way, it's your fault. I mean, like, I didn't really have that conversation, but that's kind of what it boiled down to. And, you know, I was never mistreated in school. I was never called names. Like, I had a perfectly adequate upbringing, and this was all on the res. You know, I grew up very poor. You know, we struggled as a family, but, you know, from the queer perspective, like, that completely fine. And, you know, I don't know how common of an experience that might be, but, you know, like stories like mine exist on the res. Like they're not inherently like sob stories or, you know, stories of oppression or quote unquote resilience that is ascribed to us so commonly.
Almost exclusively is queerness understood through the lens of trauma and popular U.S. discourse.
Which, like, trauma and resilience and like...
Seems like sometimes.
Yeah, you're right. That is really common. It doesn't leave a lot for anything in between, which is probably where most people lie in terms of their experiences. That makes me, you know, you were talking about, Kennard, that you grew up really poor on the res. And, you know, like as leftists, we talk about class. Like, you know, it's interesting, like in a lot of Native politics, people don't talk much about class, even though, of course, it affects everything too. Political vantage points and then like structures of power and then how things are produced and reproduced. Do you think like there's like an important class element or an analysis of class that should be had? I mean, not just in Indigenous politics, but almost like even in like the queer political communities that you're aware of? Yeah. And like, what is the effect of like class difference, you know, in LGBTQ politics?
I think, let's see. It's a lot. Can't really think off the top of my head when it comes to that. But I mean, I don't know about YouTube, but, you know, like my race and my class status have always been at the forefront of my identity and not really my queerness just because of the way I grew up. But yeah, like, you know, when I was growing up, like the fact that I was poor was kind of like what weighed heavily on my mind day to day. And then, you know, once I left the res and went to college, I went to Harvard. So, you know, that, you know, going to Harvard is very much, you know, I was reminded of my class. I was reminded of my race and my class every single day. And,
yeah.
And, you know, like, and then also the fact that, you know, going into I don't even know how to describe Harvard. aside from, hell. But uh,
I went to Yale for my master's degree, so I think I know a little
yeah,
bit
like
what you're talking about.
I'm sure there was a sense of community to be had, but I never felt, kinship or community with a lot of the queer spaces on campus, because, it was very like, it catered to respectability politics. It was very like white, cis, and heteronormative. And so I just like never felt welcomed in a lot of queer spaces, outside of my own friend group.
Mhm.
And, my closest friends, most of them were also gay. We bonded over being poor. We didn't really bond over, we bonded over being gay, of course, but we also bonded over being poor because, at the beginning of the term, things kind of self-segregate based on how much money people have to do what activities. So when you're poor, you just end up stuck with all the poor kids, and that's how you make friends with them.
It's like high school. It's just like in school. I spent full of poor kids at college. High school.
Yeah, nothing highlights your class status like going to college, even a rugged ass public university like UNM. I was like, oh shit. To be honest, like I didn't realize like that I was poor until I went to college, because that was just how those were the only material conditions I saw anyone around me living in. So I was like, so when you see other people, in a very obviously different class position, it changes everything. And it's, I don't know, it's something I'm still dealing with and trying to, I don't know, I guess make peace with or like understand. It's really trippy. And going to conferences, going to bougie conferences, and like can't afford to stay at the venue or to eat the food there, and like I don't know. But anyways, so what I was gonna get at is queer liberation not inherently a class struggle? I mean, again, going back to who we see as the forerunners of queer liberation in the US, they were poor, Black and brown, trans women, and or who we understand to be trans women now. A lot of them didn't actually explicitly identify as such back in the day, but we know that their demands were for healthcare and housing and safe working conditions to exit the sex trade, right? That's why STAR formed, is to help people in the sex trade, to help provide them with housing and food and political education. And so were those not always the demands for queer liberation, like rooted in class struggle?
Yeah. I think also like when you think about grassroots, like radical feminism that came out of working class, like proletariat, like feminists of color, whether they're from the global South, I would, like Indigenous feminists, Indigenous women are primarily also part of the proletariat, in the so-called United States. And that working class women of color feminism has also pretty much always been about what you just said, class struggle, Jen. It's about housing and education and transportation and like safety, right? It's about, I think the things that I often think of as like the project of socialism, actually, like those broader, like what is Ruth, the social wage. Ruthie Wilson Gilmore calls it the social wage, social wage. And that in and of itself, that all of those things which would require like structural transformation, i.e. really taking on capitalism, right? And the way that capitalism guts those kinds of functions in liberal nation states, but also how capitalism creates like these conditions of constant exploitation and violence that different classes of people have to, like lower classes of people and colonized people have to experience, but that, like advocating for those types of things, healthcare, universal healthcare, that is also like a deeply queer, deeply feminist, but I think also like a deeply socialist kind of project that I think is also often erased when, I don't know, pride becomes about rainbow capitalism. What is rainbow capitalism? What's the definition of that?
Before we move,
and how does that play into like this conversation we're having about class?
Before we move on to that, I do agree with you that, like what we kind of conceptualize as queer liberation meshes well with, like the socialist definitions of freedom Like, who gives a shit about, freedom of speech, all of these like abstract American Western ideas of freedom. It's like for us as socialists and communists, like freedom to us is freedom from unemployment, freedom from homelessness, freedom from hunger, the freedom of having access to healthcare, like all of these material freedoms that make our lives better. Like that, I think that's, queer liberation and, socialist conceptions of freedom, I think they're pretty much one and the same.
Absolutely. And, people, again, I always remind people Pride wasn't a riot, it was a rebellion because it was not spontaneous. The people behind it were actually organizers, and many of them did identify as socialists. Like Sylvia Rivera was in the Young Lords who stormed a hospital in the Bronx so that opioid users could detox there. Like that's a powerful victory that gets overlooked a lot. And I think there's obviously a reason why their affiliation and claiming of these political traditions gets erased. And I think maybe that's part of what reinforces rainbow capitalism today. And as we were prepping, I was just talking about how this year I've never seen it so full blown. Like every single advertisement, every single major company, every single major bank, like has their rainbow logo up, and it's never been more blatant and in your face. And people are just like, "Oh, it's so progressive, so
have you
cool.
Seen,
the world is
that
changing."
even the defense
but really, I'm just like appalled
Pride
every
logos.
single day.
Like Raytheon even included. If you go to Raytheon's Twitter, they changed their logo to not only have rainbow, but also the trans colors and then black and brown bars.
What? That is disgusting.
Yeah. And I think when we talk about rainbow capitalism, I think, it also meshes with like the fracturing of like queer solidarity because, pre-1969, by and large, like all, I think we had solidarity because we were like universally hated, by US society. And then, you only have quote unquote victories or, once you have like upward mobility for like white gay men who are, at the top of the pyramid, once they have, the income to be consumers, that's when you start seeing, all of this pandering and catering and all of the rainbow capitalism. I'm kind of like word vomiting right now. I hope you guys can also elucidate on that.